that's my final slide, I believe. That's taken from 3 kilometers away. The crew using the lunar rover actually got as far as 7 kilometers away and out of sight of the limb. The small spot in the middle is the lunar module in the distance. That represents about as far out on a limb as I think human beings have ever gone. But it was a very successful mission. It also found a small pebble of the original crust material. Is that it? So that comes to the end of the pictures. I would like to entertain questions. I hope you have questions, and just raise your hand and shout them out.
How easier it would be to write the exact same software with today's languages and functionalities?
It's a very good question. In some ways harder, in some ways easier. You know, the fact that we, in those days, could look at our goals so directly. We had fewer managers holding us behind. But of course, and what I said before, that the entire program was there in one book so you could fully understand it. But of course, the modern languages and the modern computers are much faster, the languages are much more capable, and that should make it easier. So it's, I don't have a crisp answer to that. In some ways, the fact that we're stuck with the advanced technology holds us back, perhaps. You know, a decision that Alan Klump and I could make, you know, in an hour's discussion one day might take a month in a committee now.
Okay. So what do you think about SpaceX and private space travel?
I have a great deal of admiration for SpaceX and for what Mr. Musk is doing. I think that's really something I like to see technology used for. I have much greater reservations about Mr. Zuckerberg, for example.
Did the guidance computer have any effects from radiation, or the fact that you run on magnetic core memory eliminated the issue?
I think the primitiveness, if that's the right word, of the memory protected us from having to worry about radiation. And for that same reason, for the vital functions of the space station, the computers are fairly out of date, you know, in Earth terms, although there's also much more modern computers on the space station that are used for non-flight vital things.
It was hard to flip a bit with magnetic.
Yep,
right?
yep. And you know, the size of the wires was bigger. You know, you were less likely to have, you know, single event upsets of any kind. Ah.
If you had to go back and rewrite all those programs, which kind of advices would you like to tell to yourself?
Well, that's interesting, because in the course of writing the book, I did several times think, well, gee, why didn't we do this? You know, the throttle problem, for example, we could have had logic that would have empirically figured out what the time lags and so forth were. So I've certainly had ideas about things that we could have done different in the coding that might have been better. Was that your question?
Which advice?
Oh, which advice? To focus on the objective, to have an organization that lets you do that, to trust the youngsters more, to be more tolerant of mistakes, you know, along the way, because you have to make mistakes to learn. You know, for the programmers themselves, I would say the same thing. To, you know, to well, let me put it this way: there's so many things you can do with technology now to get rich, and I think at that time there was something about the idealism of the period that made it easier for us to do a program like this. I think it's sometimes said that the success of Apollo was something that was done despite the ferment of the culture at that time, but I disagree with that. I think to some extent it was something that was able to be done because of that.
Did you apply for the job or did they come and get you?
No, I applied for it. I had graduated from college. I did not have a very good degree, a bachelor's degree, but I had not been a great student. And I felt that it was up to me to find a job. I probably would have taken anything offered to me, but I did happened to walk in one hot summer day to the instrumentation lab. I was given a long form to fill out, and then to my surprise immediately spoke to the head personnel officer, who immediately lined up interviews. So I did apply for it, but it was an easy application, and but there was a certain amount of chance involved. It was probably the luckiest single event of my life to have gotten involved in that.
Sort of an administrative question. So it's not clear to me what's the relationship between the MIT Instrumentation Lab and MIT itself.
Mm-hmm. Well, it was originally a lab within the Aero and Astro department, and it was still that way when I joined, but it had gotten so big that it was, you could call it a semi-independent organization. It had, I believe, about 3,000 people when I started. But this, of course, was the era also of the Vietnam War. And in addition to Apollo, the laboratory was involved in a great deal of military work, which gave it a bad name among certain parts of the MIT community. And so as of the early 70s, we were divested from MIT, becoming an independent nonprofit corporation dedicated to the advancement of technology in the national interest. And we still to this day, have a relationship with MIT that allows staff to be shared. For example, there are people at the lab who still teach courses at MIT, and people at the lab and retired people like me still get to use the MIT facilities, but we are a completely separate organization located very close to each other.
To my understanding, when the lunar module landed on the moon, it had to be depressurized to get the astronaut on the surface. So the computer and all the instrumentation had to be exposed to vacuum. Did it have any effect on the cooling, or the sheer mass of the capsule and the heat capacity of the metal was enough to cool it off, or did you have to liquid cool it and have a radiator on the outside?
No. Not necessary, and not my field to analyze that, but no, nothing like that was necessary.
It was a great question, really. So, being an engineer working for the space and the Apollo mission, how did you go to the bathroom? Because this is a question that asking to all the astronauts. No, I'm joking. What was your feeling after you saw Apollo 17, the last mission, coming back and splashing down? What was your feeling at the end of this incredible project?
Well, regarding the bathroom, I'll just quote one line. I believe it was John Young who wrote a memo regarding how to have a bowel movement in space, and it began, first get naked, allow an hour. I think it was done with tape on bags. The feeling, a great feeling of satisfaction, but of course it was also something that had occupied my life for 6.5 years that was coming to an end. And there was a little bit of a fear on my part then that I might have to choose between finding a completely different job or working on a strategic weapons project that I would not have wanted to do. In fact, as we were able to stay involved in manned spaceflight, we transitioned to the shuttle era. We were no longer in the running to develop the primary guidance system because now industry had caught up and there were other places who could aspire to that. But we did help NASA by running tests of the design before it was actually implemented. We had an influence on the crew interface. We developed something called mode spec disp architecture that you could think of as something a little bit like Windows in the sense that things could overlay each other. Modes being the mutually exclusive modes that represented the different phases of the mission. Specs being things that you could the analogy would be the buttons on a car radio where only one station selected at a time. The specs or specialists, which was analogous to a row of toggle switches. These were smaller things that could be run at the same time as the modes. But for each of those, there was a display that overlay the mode display. And then finally disps, which were simply displays that brought up specific pieces of information from inside the computer. So we were doing that during the shuttle era. And then as we entered the space station era, I'll call it, we were developing simulations. I developed a simulation that used some computer graphics circa 1980 something, an Evans and Sutherland machine we had that looked into ways you might use a computer graphics display system aboard a space station for training, for creating a synthetic view, if you will, where there wasn't actually a window. And then the most interesting thing personally was that a sequencing language that I developed for simulation use in the early 80s called Timeliner, it was a language and everything to implement it, a language based on temporal concepts like when, whenever, before and after. It ran very slowly. It was meant to sort of replace the high-level sequencing that the man would do, such that as different operations became routine, they could be now programmed in Timeliner to take some of the workload off the crew. I got ahead of myself a little bit because that was developed originally for running simulations, but in the early 90s, we saw that NASA wanted to have something they called a user interface language. And when I looked at what they wanted, I realized that a great deal of what they wanted we already had in Timeliner. And so in the early 90s, there was an interesting period. During about 2 hours during Apollo 14, a man named Russ Larson sort of sold our concept down in Houston, working with the same person again over the course of 2 years. We basically talked to the flight control community and the payload operations community and convinced them both that what we had was superior to the alternative. It was an alternative from IBM. And so we were able to sort of crash the party. And as a result, I'm possibly the only person who has substantial code on Apollo, but also running right now on the space station in Earth orbit. I'm not the only person. I know of at least one person who worked with me in each case, who has some code on both systems. But
Ok, se non ci sono altre domande direi un ultimo applauso a Don. Grazie Don. Per chi volesse un ricordo di questa serata, abbiamo portato le pagine che riprendono il software Apollo 14, sì, con il problema famoso del pulsante di abort, che Don vi autograferà qui, e l'articolo che ha scritto Fabrizio per la nostra rivista Spaceflight, che parla appunto di Don e della sua avventura.
Photograph by
sì,
Denise Bosco.
By Denise Bosco, che è la compagna di Don e che ha vissuto a Milano per 2 anni, poco tempo fa, e che ci allieta con la sua presenza in questi giorni. Sì, 5 euro e ci aiutate per sostenere il progetto. Quindi se volete potete venire qui e chiedere l'autografo originale di Don. Grazie a tutti, buona serata.